And if you vote for me on day one, I will commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht to a sentence of time served.
This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy.
Guten Tag, buenos dias, morgen, and welcome to episode 199 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. It is a cold, windy day here on Florida's Space Coast. It isn't quite as cold as it is up north in the Florida Panhandle. That's about a 2.5-hour drive away from here. And those 180 miles make quite a bit of difference in the weather from time to time, especially during the winter. I mean, it's just about as hot and swampy up there as it is down here during the summer. But in the winter, it can get 20, 30 degrees colder in the Panhandle than it does in the more tropical areas of Florida. For example, I have coconuts, mangoes, and pineapples growing in my yard, but they won't grow even an hour north of here. But even though North Florida does get a lot colder than the central part of Florida, and certainly than the south part of Florida or the Keys, they usually don't see full-on blizzard conditions. They do get snow, like probably once every couple of years or so, certainly no more than one dusting every winter, and not every winter, at least not that I can recall. But normally it's just flurries or a little mix of ice and snow, frozen rain. But yesterday and last night, they got a little more than 11 inches of snow in many places. That's almost 1 foot of snow, or 28 centimeters for those of you who don't do imperial numbers, for those of you on the metric system. And that is certainly unusual. That, of course, however, is not the big news, but it is just one of the many ways that things just feel different today. Like we're truly beginning a new era, like everything has changed. We woke up and we just live in a different world. If you're listening in Europe, you woke up to the news that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has freed Ross Ulbricht, making more than good on his promise that he made to both libertarians at their national convention and to Bitcoiners in his speech at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville this year. Donald Trump tweeted, or actually this was retweeted because he doesn't really use Twitter as much as he uses his Truth social media network. So this is a repost from Truth, but he posted, "I just called the mother of Ross William Ulbricht to let her know that in honor of her and the libertarian movement, which supported me so strongly, it was my pleasure to have just signed a full and unconditional pardon for her son, Ross. The scum that worked to convict him were some of the same lunatics who were involved in the modern-day weaponization of government against me. He was given 2 life sentences plus 40 years. Ridiculous." There were many who impatiently and prematurely savaged President Trump when midnight came on Inauguration Day and Ross wasn't free yet. I do think, though, that if you clicked on many of those profiles, and I did just to see who was posting such nasty things, and you scrolled through their feed a bit, it was largely coming from people who were loudly outspoken never-Trumpers for the entire election. So most of that should be taken with a grain of salt. One thing that I was trying to tell everybody that they needed to keep into perspective, that day one of any presidency really begins on the 21st. You know, the 20th is Inauguration Day, but the president takes the oath of office sometime around noon on that day. And then Inauguration Day is a lot of pomp and circumstance. It's speeches, it's parades, the balls, the inaugural ball. Usually there's 3, 4, 5 or more of those, depending on how big the inauguration party is. And while it is traditional that a president sign an executive order or two on Inauguration Day, and Trump certainly signed a slew of them, really that's ceremonial. It's just tradition. Here, sign something to show you're president. The work really doesn't get started until the next morning. And when that happened, we ended up getting more than we expected. We were promised, as the clip that I played in the intro said, that Donald Trump would commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht, and he gave Ross a full unconditional pardon. If you don't know the difference between a commutation and a full pardon, it's night and day. A full pardon means that Ross can now go on with his life with absolutely no restrictions whatsoever. Legally, it is like none of this ever happened, like he was never convicted, like he never went to prison. I know he'll never be the same. He'll carry those scars for his life, but legally, as far as what he's allowed to do now, it's like this never happened. A commutation, on the other hand, would have just meant that his sentence was cut short, that he could go home early, but he would have still been a convicted felon. He would have been an ex-con being released from prison, subject to the same restrictions as any other convict released from prison. And that's usually parole, having to report in with a parole officer, doing weekly or monthly drug testing and alcohol testing. You're not allowed to vote. You're not allowed to own a gun. You can't have many, many different professional licenses if you're a convicted felon. None of that applies to Ross now. He can vote. He can go out and get a passport and travel internationally while on parole, for example. You can't even leave the state that you're supposed. Well, if you're convicted in state court, you can't leave that state. If you're convicted in federal court, you can't leave the state where you reside without permission of your parole officer in advance. If you want to go visit your parents out of state, you have to talk to the parole department, to your probation officer, your parole officer, and get written permission to leave. Otherwise, you can get sent right back to jail just for crossing state lines. None of that applies to Ross. They could have said that you can't access the internet without supervision, that you can't speak at conferences. There could have been all kinds of crazy restrictions. None of that applies to Ross. He can now be a doctor, a lawyer, or any other profession that requires professional licensing that's restricted to people that have felony convictions. Hell, he couldn't even open a bar or restaurant as a convicted felon. Not a restaurant that has a liquor license, for example, because in most states you can't get a license to sell beer, wine, or liquor if you're a convicted felon. Instead, he can live his life any way he chooses with no restrictions. And I find it incredibly fitting that the pardon was signed on January 21st. Had he been pardoned just a couple hours after Donald Trump was sworn in, he would have been pardoned on the 20th. And something about 21. The number 21 is really important to us us Bitcoiners. And so I just think it's fitting. Free Ross Day on January 20th just wouldn't be the same as Free Ross Day on 1/21. And many people are already proposing that the 21st of January every year be honored as a Bitcoin holiday. Clark Moody tweeted out yesterday, January 21st, Ross Ulbricht Day. I know Guy Swan and other people tweeted out something similar, proposing that it be Ross Freedom Day or Ross Ulbricht Day. I'm sure that'll be sorted out in the next few years or the next few months, sometime before next January. But if you haven't seen the picture of Ross Ulbricht walking out of prison, he's wearing gray sweats, a gray sweatshirt, walking across the prison parking lot with everything that he currently owns in a backpack slung over his shoulder, except a little potted plant that he's holding. Looks like maybe a mango or an avocado or something. I can't tell from the picture, but some little plant that he was nurturing in his jail cell. I think that picture is going to become in the history books, the history of Bitcoin. That photograph, that picture is going to be every bit as well known, every bit as iconic as the running Bitcoin picture of Hal Finney running. And many people might be wondering why this is so important to Bitcoiners. Certainly why you would compare someone like Ross Ulbricht to someone like Hal Finney, who was instrumental in the very launching of the very code that runs Bitcoin. But if you're relatively new to Bitcoin, or even if you've been here a while, because Ross was in prison for more than a decade, you might not know the full story behind the Ross Ulbricht saga. And it's certainly a long story, and I don't have time to get into all of that. That would take up more than an episode in and of itself. But on Twitter, VJ Boyapati did a pretty good job of summing it up yesterday when he tweeted, quote, "Newcomers to Bitcoin may not understand why old-timers care so much about Ross Ulbricht. Let me explain. He embodied the ethos of early Bitcoiners more than anyone. He was an entrepreneur who created a thriving marketplace. He believed in radical freedom, including the freedom to trade anything with anyone so long as it was peaceful and voluntary. He regularly wrote about his views on freedom and why he built the first truly successful Bitcoin business, the Silk Road. He wanted to create a better world, and he believed his principles deeply. Politicians like Schumer targeted both Silk Road and Bitcoin as criminal enterprises that needed to be shut down. When he was convicted, the judge and the establishment threw the book at him. He was a first-time, nonviolent criminal, and they locked him up and effectively threw away the key. In the early Bitcoin community, we all felt how unjust this was. It was like they were locking up one of our own out of spite for what we all believed was a peaceful revolution. Now, tens of millions of people own Bitcoin, and many just because of number go up. Never forget, there was a deeper purpose here, and that getting rich is a nice side effect of that greater purpose. Fix the money, fix the world. So incredibly well put, VJ. American Hodl, who has come a long way from his early days when he was purely an S-poster, had an interesting tweet about the significance of the Ross Ulbricht pardon, putting it into a slightly different perspective. He tweeted out, "A friend just told me the following, quote, I remember years ago when you told me we'll know we have a Bitcoin president when at Real Ross U was freed, and I remember thinking it was the most retarded thing I'd ever heard. Me, why did you think that? Quote, it just seemed like something that would never happen. Like, why would any president ever do that? Bitcoin makes impossible things possible." So definitely an interesting perspective through the eyes of American Hodl. Naturally, many Bitcoiners have already expressed the desire to help support Ross now that he is out of prison. As of last night, Ross's official Twitter site had posted that there would be a way to do so, but they needed to concentrate on just getting Ross home, and that there would be more to follow, basically. But Kraken, the crypto exchange, has certainly stepped up to the plate, tweeting just a couple hours ago, "Dear Ross, all of us at Kraken want to make sure that after what you've been through, you're able to land on your feet with the support of the community that loves you most, the Bitcoin community. That is why we've donated $111,111 in Bitcoin to you, Kraken." So certainly a nice gesture. And I also saw another story that apparently there were a dozen or so Bitcoin wallets that belonged to Ross Ulbricht that were never seized by the Department of Justice. Probably it's speculated because of the time they were basically dust, but that they've got over $1 million worth of Bitcoin in them now. I think it was like $11 million. It was a substantial amount of Bitcoin in them now. Unknown if Ross still has access to those wallets or not. Ross is a smart guy. You don't know what happened to all of his stuff, but if there's, what was seized by the government, what was destroyed, what was thrown out, but hopefully he has access to some of that old Bitcoin, because it would be nice to see Ross emerge from prison as a millionaire, a multimillionaire, even though, he would have been a billionaire had they not seized all that Silk Road Bitcoin from him. But I digress. There is certainly a lot to talk about today, including Ross Ulbricht and the new president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. But before we get into that any further, let's stop and take a customary look at Bitcoin's vital statistics. Also, I'm also running up against a hard stop here, so I've got an extensive series of notes sitting in front of me as I sit here recording. And I'm recording in my house today because that weather I mentioned to you, my studio, as I've complained about multiple times, does not have a heater. Here in Florida, it's not unusual for houses to not have air conditioning, let alone heaters. But my studio has air conditioning, but not a heater. And so it is just chilly out there. I went out there and I grabbed my microphone and a headset out of the studio, and I'm set up in my bedroom in my house. And speaking of the foul weather, because I am at home, one of my family members was traveling. They went to New York City, and there's something going around in New York City because they brought back a pretty nasty virus. So hopefully it'll be a nice, quiet next few minutes while I record this podcast. But if you hear anybody coughing and hacking in the background, that's one of my family members trying their best not to cough too loudly, because I am recording in the house. So also I'm running up against a hard stop here, so I might have to as I mentioned, I might have to cut off this podcast before I get through all my notes. But before that becomes a problem, let's breeze through these vital statistics. Right now, at the time of this recording, we are at a block height of 880,441, exactly 1,001 blocks higher than the last DCA Wednesday episode. And Bitcoin is currently ringing in at $102,880 per Bitcoin. I know that's not an all-time high. The new all-time high for Bitcoin is around $109,000, depending on where you get your price data. But zooming out on a weekly basis, from a Bitcoin DCA Wednesday episode basis, this is the highest Bitcoin has ever been during any episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. Unfortunately, the flip side of that means that you will also be receiving the lowest number of Satoshis per dollar. Right now, every US dollar that you convert to Bitcoin will give you 972 Satoshis. So bummer that we're once again below 1,000 sats per dollar. But as Bitcoin goes up into the right and fiat goes down in value compared to Bitcoin and everything else, the number of Satoshis you're going to be able to get for that fiat will continue to dwindle. Bitcoin's current price, however, puts it back over that $2 trillion market cap figure, 2.04 trillion to be specific. That's only the second DCA Wednesday where we've seen a market cap of 2 trillion or higher. So that is really cool. And for those of you who continue to cling to your shiny yellow rocks, your precious Peter Schiff bucks, it will currently cost you 37.3 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin. That is up from last DCA Wednesday, as well as the DCA Wednesday before that, as even though gold is near all-time record highs in its valuation against the US dollar, as every commodity goes up in US dollar value terms because the US dollar value is being printed into oblivion. As inflation goes up, obviously everything gets more expensive, not just eggs and peanut butter, but also those gold bars. It's just that gold, even though it's near an all-time record high, is still trending to zero in Bitcoin terms. So for those of you who haven't gotten off zero, who are still gold maximalists instead of Bitcoin maximalists, they say you get Bitcoin at the price you deserve. And right now, that price for gold bugs is 37.3 ounces of gold for just one Bitcoin. For those of you who value your wealth in pizza, Bitcoin's at an all-time record pizza high. One Bitcoin will currently purchase you 5,753 large pepperoni pizzas from Papa John's. That works out to one pizza every day for pushing 16 years now, just under 16 years. A heck of a lot of pizza for just one Bitcoin. And moving right along, that metric that you know has been my favorite metric for the entire history of this podcast, Bitcoin's 24-hour average transaction rate, is zooming right along at an average of 4.66 transactions per second. Again, I'm not a TA guy. I think that there are no real metrics to measure Bitcoin or to make any prediction about how Bitcoin's going to do, because Bitcoin's going to do what Bitcoin's going to do, and nobody has a crystal ball. But interestingly enough, for the entire history of this podcast, every time the average transaction rate was up, the price of Bitcoin was up. And the average transaction rate is significantly up from last DCA Wednesday, and so is the price. So, they say correlation doesn't equal causation, but it is fun to notice that those two metrics have had that correlation, at least for the last 3.5 years, and on Wednesdays when we do this podcast. Speaking of on-chain activity, the Bitcoin mempool is still relatively full, but continuing its trend towards clearing. Clark Moody's dashboard's mempool is showing that there are now less than 100,000 transactions pending, 94,790 transactions to be specific, as opposed to 104,000 transactions last Wednesday and 133,000 transactions the DCA Wednesday before that. Mempool.space runs a slightly larger mempool as opposed to the default size mempool that Clark Moody runs. But even mempool.space's larger mempool is showing about 5,000 or 6,000 fewer transactions than last DCA Wednesday, currently showing 115,789,000 transactions, as opposed to just a little over 121,000 transactions last Wednesday. I know I tend to talk really fast in general, and so I'm trying to speed that up even more so this week because I have so much I want to cover, and I'm watching the clock tick down towards midnight. So I apologize if I'm speaking too fast for you. Back to the statistics. If you need to send an on-chain transaction, Clark Moody's fee estimator is currently recommending a fee of 6 sats per VByte for a high priority transaction, a little bit cheaper than last Wednesday when they were recommending 7 sats per VByte. They're saying that a fee of just 1 sat per VByte will be mined within a day, and even their fee, well, that's the lowest recommended fee they have. So a high priority transaction, they're recommending a fee of just 6 sats per VByte, and any other priority, a fee of just 1 sat per VByte, they're saying should be mined even within a day. Mempool.space tells a slightly different story. They're recommending a fee of 7 sats per VByte for a high priority transaction. At the current US dollar value of Bitcoin, that works out to $1.01 for that transaction at 7 sats per VByte. Looking at the blocks, it's been 25 minutes since the last block was mined, and the 2 blocks prior to this both included fees of just 1 sat per VByte. So that higher fee of 7 sats per VByte, I think, is just temporary based on the fact that it's been more than twice the average block time since the last block. Along those lines, they're saying a medium priority transaction should include a fee of 6 sats per VByte. A low priority transaction should include a fee of 4 sats per VByte. And they're saying a no priority transaction, the lowest fee rate you should set, period, for any transaction is 2 sats per VByte. Again, I think that's skewed by the fact it's been a little longer than average since the last block was mined. So if you have a high priority transaction you need to send on chain, make sure you have the most recent picture, the most up-to-date data, the most up-to-date estimates. Maybe look at the blockchain itself on mempool.space, see what the previous blocks were included and what they were including, whether what the lowest fee rates were before you try and lowball it. And certainly, if you do try and lowball your fee, make sure you know how to use replace by fee, child pays for parent, or mempool.space's transaction accelerator. So if you do lowball the fee and fees go up before your transaction gets confirmed, that you can modify that transaction to make sure that it does get mined. We are now just 551 blocks away from the next mining difficulty adjustment. And last Wednesday, it was looking like it was going to be an increase of about 0.5%. This time we're getting conflicting numbers. One site I'm looking at says there's going to be a slight difficulty decrease of just over 1%. And another says it's actually going to be a slight increase of around 0.13%. Currently, with 551 blocks remaining before that difficulty adjustment, blocks have been averaging 10 minutes and 7 seconds during this difficulty epoch. And of course, that's longer than the 10 minutes between blocks on average that Bitcoin's aiming for. So if that continues, there would be a difficulty decrease to try and speed those up. But anything can happen in the next about 4 days left before that adjustment is made. But in general, the difficulty goes up and to the right, just like Bitcoin's price, because in general, the network hash power securing the Bitcoin network goes up and to the right. And even with it looking like there might be a slight difficulty decrease, the estimated hash rate securing the network has gone up since last Wednesday. Last Wednesday, it was estimated there were 758.9 exahash of computer power securing the network. Currently, that's estimated there's 763.2 exahash securing the network. So I guess we won't know until the difficulty adjustment occurs. But again, that really only makes a big difference if you're a miner or invested in mining, because if you're an average pleb, just because the average time is 10 minutes and 7 seconds between blocks, that doesn't mean the next block won't take 30 minutes or potentially even 2 minutes, because it is basically random chance. So a lot like flipping a coin where you might get heads 3 times in a row. You won't necessarily get tails on the next flip just because you've already had 3 heads in a row. But on average, if you averaged 2016 coin flips, you would have 1,008 heads and 1,008 tails or so. All right, before we get on to the news, I want to take a minute to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method by either streaming sats on a minute-by-minute basis as you listen, or by sending a boost, which is a shout out via a Lightning transaction, where you can let us know what you think about the podcast, let us know something that's going on in your community, or even just say hello. But because it is a Lightning transaction, you are sending value back in the form of Satoshis. And we have 2 boosts to read this episode. They're both from Leggy. Leggy sent 2,000 sats 5 days ago after the last DCA Wednesday episode and said, Bitcoin's back again, 100K, tell a friend. So thank you, Leggy, for that shout out. And then just yesterday, or just 5 hours ago, actually, I guess it was more than 5 hours ago. It was 5 hours ago when I made the screenshot. Leggy sent a celebratory boost saying, Ross is getting free, ! OMG, ! I cannot believe it. And that was 1,000 sat boost in case I glossed over that. So thank you, Leggy. Leggy is a longtime supporter of this podcast, longtime listener. Always great to hear from you, and your boosts are always entertaining, more so than that. So hopefully I did a decent M&M impression there on that first boost, Leggy, and great to hear from you. Of course, it's great to hear from everybody, and it's good to know that we have listeners all around the world. And speaking of which, our geographic distribution of listeners has remained ossified. Our top 10 countries are still number 1, the United States, where a little over half of you are listening from. So hello and thank you to all my fellow Americans listening right here in the USA, most of which is probably pretty frozen considering how cold it is all the way down here in Florida. Number 2 remains Singapore. So hello and thank you to everybody listening in Singapore. Apa kabar? Number 3 remains Germany. So Dankeschön, mein friends in Deutschland. Number 4 remains Argentina. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Argentina. Number 5 remains Luxembourg. So again, Dankeschön, mein friends in Luxembourg, or Morien to those of you who speak Luxembourgish. Number 6 remains Canada, and OMG, I can't believe how cold it must be up in Canada if it's snowing all the way down here in Florida. So hello to those of you in the frozen white north, and thank you for listening in numbers that keep you in the number 6 spot. Number 7 remains our cousins across the pond of the United Kingdom. So hello and thank you to those of you listening in England. Number 8 remains Spain. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Spain. Number 9 remains Australia. So hello and thank you to those of you in Australia, down under. Number 10 remains Mexico. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Mexico. Again, thank you to everybody listening to this podcast, regardless of where you are listening from. It is humbling and flattering to know that we have people listening to this podcast, stacking right alongside us, literally in almost every country you can think of all around the world. All right, back to the news. We already got into the Ross Ulbricht news, but the victories continue to roll along besides just Ross Ulbricht. Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian, tweeted just yesterday that the war on crypto is ending, retweeting a decision from the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, basically overturning the Tornado Cash sanctions, saying, breaking, Texas court reverses Tornado Cash sanctions in blow to U.S. government overreach. The war on crypto is ending. And that is not necessarily Bitcoin specific, but it did have to do with it did apply to Bitcoin specifically in that Tornado Cash was a mixing service, basically a privacy service. And so any precedent set in the Tornado Cash case would have been used to apply to Bitcoin as well. Another victory that's not really Bitcoin related, but was something that was very important to most Bitcoiners, was one of the first executive orders Donald Trump signed was an order withdrawing the United States from the World Health Organization. As you know, the WHO was instrumental in trying to strip our privacy away when it came to the illness. And most importantly, even more importantly than what they had done, what they were planning on doing with the pandemic treaties that they were trying to get the rest of the world to agree to give unprecedented power the next time they tried to pull that shenanigans. So I applaud President Trump removing the United States from the WHO, because while the WHO might have had great intentions to begin with, it was certainly become just as evil an organization as the WEF. Of course, with the new administration and anticipated changes in the government's attitude towards Bitcoin, it is highly likely that many of the projects and products that we were looking forward to, I mentioned Backed, for example, in the last DCA Wednesday podcast, but banks, exchanges, companies in the Bitcoin space had been working. They've been hiring engineers. They've been developing code. They were on the precipice of launching all of these great products to cater towards Bitcoiners. And almost all of that was squashed with Operation Choke Point 2.0. And now that Operation Choke Point 2.0 is ending, now that the SAC is is changing direction with Gary Gensler no longer being the head of the SEC, and with the crypto mom Hester Pierce being elevated in power in the SEC, at least as far as when it comes to the cryptocurrency, I forget what it's called, not task force, but the cryptocurrency committee of the SEC. Hopefully some of these projects will finally see the light of day. One preview of this was with the launch of Coinbase Bitcoin-backed loans. I know the Bitcoin-backed loans on Coinbase are definitely less than ideal. Your Bitcoin's converted to wrap Bitcoin, which may or may not become a taxable event. And there's all kinds of reasons not to like Coinbase in general. But it is just an example of a new product emerging that will lead to better products, because once the dam's unleashed, the innovation becomes unleashed. The capitalism, human nature in general says that if you release a crappy product, I have an incentive to one up you and release a better product. Jack Mullers, for example, mentioned that Strike will be launching a similar and hopefully better product. The idea being that a lot of the selling pressure from OGs comes because these OGs are all in on Bitcoin. Their entire fortune is Bitcoin. Most of them don't have jobs anymore other than working in the Bitcoin space, if they even do that. And so they're selling Bitcoin to live. And they don't want to necessarily sell their Bitcoin. And instead of selling their Bitcoin, now they'll have the ability to take a loan for that Bitcoin and live off the US dollars that they need while not selling their Bitcoin. And that is great for multiple reasons, because if that's you and you do need to sell Bitcoin to survive, or to make some life-changing purchase like a new home, or to pay for a wedding, or the expenses from having a new baby, a new child, growing your family, when you sell that Bitcoin, you're having to give 30-40% of that to the government in the form of capital gains taxes. But if you take a loan against that Bitcoin, even if you're paying 5, 6, 7% in interest, that's better than 30% in taxes to the federal government. So and also, because the OGs won't have to sell as much Bitcoin now, that means there'll be less Bitcoin going to the exchanges. Less Bitcoin being sold means less sell pressure on the price of Bitcoin, which is good for number go up. Either way, with all these things looming on the horizon, it is important to remember that you're still early. I don't know how many times I've emphasized this. I know that I've talked about this quite a bit in almost every one of the last podcasts in the last few months, but both in terms of Bitcoin's adoption and in the terms of where we are in this cycle's bull run, we are still early. In fact, that was one of the titles of a recent episode 189, which I titled "Another Day, Another All-Time High, and You Are Still Early." And I went in to mention that during a normal halving cycle, the all-time high occurs about 18 months after the halving. For example, in 2017, it happened after the 2016 halving. The all-time high was in December 2017. After the 2020 halving, the all-time high wasn't until November of 2021. By that logic, and using that number of blocks after the halving, we would expect to see the all-time high sometime in October or November of 2025. Certainly, that's a long way to go. I've also mentioned multiple times how I'm getting 2017 vibes. This feels like the 2017 bull run after the 2016 halving. The 2017 bull run being one of the most epic bull runs as far as the percentage increase of Bitcoin in such a short time, with Bitcoin going from less than $1,000 per Bitcoin at the beginning of 2017, all the way up to about $20,000 by December of 2017, a 20x increase. That would be the equivalent of Bitcoin going to in excess of 2 million. And with all the exciting things to come, I mean, that doesn't seem as crazy as it sounded maybe just a week or two ago. American Hodl had yet another great tweet about this, saying, "I don't know who needs to hear this, but you're not late to Bitcoin. You're still early. In fact, you're not even late to this bull run. You're still early. A lot of you probably don't believe that, and that's because we're currently in disbelief." And then he tweeted out a picture of the Wall Street cheat sheet, Psychology of a Market, where it shows basically just the different stages: disbelief, hope, optimism, belief, thrill, euphoria, etc., and all the way back down to anger, depression, and disbelief again. And saying that we're in the disbelief cycle. And I can agree with American Hodl, because I have said exactly this over and over again, at least for the last couple months, as Bitcoin went on to set all-time high after all-time high, and people were saying, well, that's it, it's over. We're gonna go back down and consolidate, and we'll have to wait until the next halving cycle to go upwards again. Obviously, that is complete hooey. One of the reasons why I believe this cycle will be one of the biggest, most impressive cycles everywhere is because of that nation state FOMO, that corporate FOMO, and now even state FOMO, with another state introducing a proposal to establish a Bitcoin strategic reserve. On January 17th, for example, Wyoming introduced legislation proposing a strategic reserve. And then just the other day, Utah, I think, became the 11th or 12th state to propose a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Those other states including Arizona, right here in Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Wyoming, of course, Utah, as I just mentioned. I think it's 11 states now, all have strategic Bitcoin reserves being proposed in their legislature. So again, I mean, that's 11 is not even half of 50. So we're still early, and there are plenty of states that still have the opportunity to front run other states. In fact, none of the states have actually established the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. It's looking like either Florida or Texas might be the first one to get that done. Only time will tell, but when they do, and we're already seeing the signs of this because there's already FOMO in the states that are rushing to propose Bitcoin Strategic Reserves. Certainly, if we get a strategic reserve on a federal level, we're going to see state FOMO in addition to nation state FOMO. And, there's 50 states. That means if every state wanted to own 1 million Bitcoin, they couldn't do it. There's only 1 million Bitcoin, not even 1 million Bitcoin left to be mined. So every company that wants to put Bitcoin on this balance sheet, every billionaire that wants to buy Bitcoin, every state that wants to buy Bitcoin, every pension fund that decides they want to buy Bitcoin, the only way they're going to be able to stack, say, $1 billion worth of Bitcoin is if the price of Bitcoin goes up to the point where the available supply of Bitcoin available for them to purchase is so expensive that they can buy $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, regardless of whether that's 1 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin, 100 Bitcoin, or whatever the case may be. But the more buy pressure there is on Bitcoin, supply and demand says if supply remains the same but demand goes up, then price goes up. And we certainly see that in every cycle with the euphoria phase, with just retail demand increasing, driving the price. And then now we got to the point where corporate and institutional demand is driving the price. And already we have El Salvador and potentially other countries out there stacking that we don't even know about yet. But when nation state FOMO and state FOMO kicks into high gear, we're going to be talking about government FOMO, country FOMO, not retail, not institution, but nation state FOMO. And that's coming. All right. I breezed through most of what I wanted to talk about, and that's good because I am running out of time here. It is after 11 p.m. on the East Coast here. We're running out of Wednesday. So I need to wrap this podcast up and get it cut, edited, and uploaded before midnight, or it'll be DCA Thursday before I get this posted. So on to what makes today and every Wednesday special. And that, of course, is that it is DCA Wednesday. What is DCA, you might ask, if you're just joining us? Well, DCA is short for dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals, regardless of price. For example, we chose our equal portion at just $20 because I wanted to keep it a small enough amount that the majority of people listening to this podcast could relate to, could say, I could stack at least $20 a week. And a regular interval was Wednesday, weekly on Wednesdays, so once a week. And this is now, this is going to be our 183rd stack. So far, we've stacked 182 times, converting a total of $3,640 into a stack of 10,312,969 sats. I mentioned that we chose $20 a week as our equal portion. Again, that's a you do you thing. Obviously, people like Michael Saylor aren't stacking just $20 a week. So if $20 is nothing to you, obviously you choose what value you feel comfortable stacking on a weekly basis. But it is important to note that it's stacking just $20 a week, even as little as $20 a week. That adds up quickly, and it added up to a total of $3,640 in just 182 Wednesdays. To grow that stack, as usual, I'm going to use the handy dandy Cash App. I've got Cash App open, and I've loaded $20 onto Cash App. First time I've had to do that in a while because I actually didn't have money on Cash App. I usually have at least $20 on Cash App. But I've loaded it, and one of the reasons I like Cash App is because despite the fact I just added that $20, they're going to let me turn that $20 into Bitcoin immediately, and they're going to let me withdraw that Bitcoin immediately, and they're going to let me do so without charging me a mining fee. So even though Cash App charges one of the more expensive, one of the higher fees for purchasing Bitcoin, they're one of the few services that will let you either transfer that Bitcoin immediately, or even some services won't even let you spend your money for 5 to 10 days until that US dollar settles. But I digress. Of course, Cash App is not a sponsor of the show. I just like them. I think they're one of the easiest ways to stack Bitcoin. I like the fact they're not going to charge me a mining fee when I move that Bitcoin to my hardware wallet. And I think overall, Jack Dorsey is good for the Bitcoin space. He's a Bitcoin promoter, a Lightning Network promoter. And I certainly like him more than I like Brian Armstrong and Coinbase. Again, this is a you do you thing. What's important is that you pick a service you like and you stack, and that you take custody of that Bitcoin. So I've got Cash App open. I've got the Bitcoin tab open. So it's just a matter of tapping buy, entering $20, hitting confirm. And boom, just like that, we've added another 19,001 Satoshis to our stack. Depressing to see that once again, we're stacking less than 20,000 sats, less than 1,000 sats per dollar, but that is because we have now stacked at the highest price that we've ever stacked. So the all-time high on DCA Wednesday terms, at least, I know Bitcoin's all-time high was over 109,000, but for us, zooming out on a weekly basis, the highest we have ever seen Bitcoin on a DCA Wednesday episode is now $102,888. Of course, I believe Bitcoin's going to go a heck of a lot higher than that. So I'm going to consider that even though we got less than 20,000 sats, that was still a bargain, still a number that one day people will look back and say, I can't believe you were able to stack 19,000 Satoshis for just $20 US. But those 19,000 sats take our total stack up to a whopping 10,331,970 sats, which is pretty impressive considering that the numbers are that when Bitcoin hyper-Bitcoinization does occur, when everyone in the world is trying to get their slice of pie, their sats for their family, and that there will only be 100 to 200,000 Satoshis per person available. And we already have 10 million of them if you've been stacking alongside us and been stacking at least $20 a week. Of course, that purchase also increased our average purchase price. It increased it to $35,424.03, up from $35,295.36 prior to this purchase. But that, again, is still not too shabby considering that's only about a third of what our stack is currently valued at. And I've always used to say when Bitcoin hits $100,000, our stack will be worth blah, 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 but we're over $100,000. But when Bitcoin hits $1 million, which I believe is more likely now than ever, even potentially this cycle, who knows? I don't have a crystal ball. Maybe it'll be 2 cycles from now or 3 cycles from now. But one thing I am sure of is that it will happen eventually. And when it does, even if we don't add another Satoshi to our stack, our current stack would have a US dollar value of $103,319.70, which is just insane to think about considering we've now converted a mere 3,660 US dollars into Bitcoin, doing so at just $20 a week. When Bitcoin hits 10 million, that means that stack will be worth more than $1 million US dollars. And if Fidelity is right, when they predicted that Bitcoin will hit 1 billion one day, in fact, they say Bitcoin will hit 1 billion US dollars by 2038. But if and when Bitcoin hits 1 billion, that stack would be worth an astounding $103,319,700 US dollars. Certainly an amount of money that would be life-changing to me or anyone I know. Even Michael Saylor, $103 million would be a big deal to him. I know he's a billionaire. I know he has billions of dollars with a Bitcoin. But even to Michael Saylor, $103 million is a significant amount of money. Before I go, I take one, as usual, I want to take one last second to ask you to help support this podcast by feeding that algorithm monster, by sharing this podcast, by rating and reviewing this episode. And of course, if you're not already doing so, by following this podcast on Twitter or X, where we are at BTC Bulletin Pod. Hopefully, I'll have a little bit more time and even more great news to talk to next Wednesday when we continue to grow this stack together. And while we wait to see what other exciting news is in store for us, I know many people have said that there's a strategic Bitcoin reserve coming or additional pro-Bitcoin executive orders that will be signed in the first 100 days of the Trump presidency. David Bailey from Bitcoin Magazine said he had been assured that at least 2 or 3 of the executive orders that they had helped propose or help draft will be signed in the coming days. And so that's really exciting because, Bitcoin is destined to do great things this cycle, great things in the future, regardless of whether the government of the United States and the governments around the world were hostile towards Bitcoin or not, because honey badger don't care. Bitcoin's going to continue going up into the right, regardless of, how hard governments try to fight Bitcoin, that Bitcoin is inevitable, it's unstoppable. But it's certainly great to see when a government is at least less hostile than it was just 2 days ago under the previous administration. But either way, don't forget to join us next Wednesday and every Wednesday while we grow that stack of Bitcoin at just $20 at a time. But either way, don't forget to keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.